Greetings, everyone. Your cartoonist pal Stan here with another episode of 50 Years in the Dungeon, the show where I bring on guests who've worked on Dungeons and Dragons and other role playing games to celebrate the fact that 2024 is the 50th anniversary of the game Dungeons and Dragons and the entire hobby of role playing. 50 years. 50 years today, not today, 50 years this year. And, it's been a major part of my life, both professionally and in terms of hobby, and all the people I've met and the folks in my life. And so this is my way to celebrate it. Have people on, we talk about their history with the game and role playing. And while we're doing that, I do a little drawing. I'm doing a cartoon homage to classic pieces of Dungeons and Dragons art. Each week, I'm picking a different product from a year, going 1 year up the timeline in the history of the game Dungeons and Dragons. And this year, I'm up to 1996, I think, 5 or 6. I don't. I have to look at my own my own little notes to remember. But 1996, in fact, and it's going to be a Planescape product for the first time. So that should be exciting. Mm-hmm. My guest this week is a game designer and raconteur and all-around fun guy, Tim Beach. I've known him for quite a while. We haven't really worked directly together on a lot of things, but we passed near each other and certainly have moved in the same circles for many years. And I'm always glad to talk to friends. Like, one of the things I like about talking to friends I haven't actually worked a lot with is I get to learn things that I didn't really know about them. So I'm especially looking forward to that this week. Tim Beach, super nice guy, and he is right here. Tim Beach, thank you for joining me.
Hey. Oh, you're very welcome. Thank you for having me.
Hey,
Glad
glad to do it. You worked at Wizards of the Coast at TSR for a while, and then you were the first TSR game designer to get hired and moved out west by Wizards of the Coast.
That is correct. And then also I was the first one laid off in the very first round of Wizards of the Coast layoffs.
I wasn't going to necessarily bring it up, but I had a feeling that might. Yeah, I mean, those early years at TSR at Wizards, keep flopping those in my head, were, they made a try at it. It didn't work out, and then they bought TSR. It worked out.
Yes, exactly. Yeah.
So let's start with just an elevator pitch. Someone says, "Tim Beach, who's Tim Beach? What's the TV guide reason why they should tune into that episode of Johnny Carson?"
Well, I wrote and worked on a ton of AD&D, second edition D&D, for those who don't call it AD&D. Anything from I put the Monsters Manual together to I wrote the Thri-Kreen of Athos for Dark Sun, a good portion of Fractal's Manifesto for Planescape, City of Delights for Al-Qadim, and several Forgotten Realms products, including Pages from the Mages, which I worked on with Ed Greenwood.
Mm-hmm. So I recall you also had a hand in on the Red Steel.
The Red Steel campaign setting, yes. I took Bruce Hurd's Princess Arc articles and went back to Merle and Jackie Rasmussen's Savage Coast and integrated and updated those to create the Red Steel campaign setting.
Right. So, got a lot going on there, and you've stayed in gaming since then. You've been doing some freelance and then independent game design in more recent years.
Right. Yes. There were a few years where I didn't do much, but I've always kept my hand in and going to conventions and that kind of thing. At the very least, I was always seeing what was out there as a possibility.
Right. All right.
But then, recently turned to self-publishing. So.
And we're going to be talking about that a little later because you've got what I think is a super interesting product that is just coming onto the market now. So there's
Yeah.
there's a little teaser. We're going to be talking about that a little later. But how I always start these conversations with how we got into gaming, because people in our uh, demographic, shall we say, people with hair our color, uh, were getting in somewhere in the time when the game was just in its offing. Right? I've had a bunch of people who were who literally were at Gary's table, which is not me, and I'm pretty sure not you. Uh, but that it in that era when it started to get out into the world, I was I was in that first wave of people uh, who were buying it in bookstores, not having to go find the weird hobby train store that happened to have the white box.
Right.
How
Yes.
did you get introduced to gaming?
So this goes back to a teacher that I had in junior high and high school, who pulled me out of study hall one day and set me down with his TRS-80 computer and handed me a book on how to learn basic programming.
Okay.
And so I started doing that, and a couple of years after that, he upgraded to an Apple II and had games. One of the games that he had on the Apple II was Temple of Apshai, which he said, this is a lot like Dungeons and Dragons. And I had no clue. But I played it, and I had a lot of fun with it. And then that Christmas, a friend of mine, Dawn, got the Red Box for a
Mm-hmm.
gift. And she handed it to me and she said, well, you've played this computer game. Teach me how to play this. So I read through the Red Box, or at least a good portion of it. I don't know I don't know very many people who have read any D&D book cover to cover, but
Well,
I read enough.
the red box. I mean, the intro boxes. It was a little easier. They were only
It was
they were only
absolutely.
90-page books.
Yeah. So I read through what I needed and I started as a DM.
So where
Um,
where did you grow up? What part of the country was that?
I grew up in southwest Iowa. Um, a little town not near anything, a little town called Sharpsburg, and about equal distance from Omaha, Des Moines, and Kansas City,
Okay.
and um,
The,
very, very small.
the heart of gaming.
Well,
I, go ahead.
I, I do credit that for my imagination because otherwise, I was kind of a little bored, maybe.
All right, so that would have been the Menser version. The red box was the Menser version.
Correct. Yeah.
Um, were you? So what was it that made that teacher think that D&D was something that would be up your alley?
Well, I don't think he really. Um, I don't think he really did. He wasn't introducing me to Dungeons and Dragons. He just said, "Oh, there's this computer game," and he knew of Dungeons and Dragons
Okay,
and
so
knew enough to say it's kind of like that.
kind of like this other
Um,
thing you don't know about.
right? Yeah.
Um,
So I got my start.
go ahead.
Well, I also I had. So I had met a friend in computer camp because in early high school I wasn't cool enough to go into any of the other summer camps, but I went to computer camp and met a guy there named Joe Marfus, who was actually a D&D player. So when I got handed the red box, I also called up Joe and said, "Hey, what can you tell me?" And he sent me to a nearby Kmart where I picked up the first edition hardcovers for AD&D.
Woohoo! And the rest is history. So,
Yeah,
so you started running for your friend, and uh, did you did you?
yeah. There were
Oh, go ahead.
sorry, there were three or four of them. Dawn and her boyfriend at the time, Dave, and my one of my best friends from high school, Wayne, who actually worked with me on the project we'll be talking about. um, and a couple of others that came in and out. But we had a little core group that we started with.
What were you running for them? Would you have your
I
own
ran
world? You start by creating a world.
Well, I started by imitating Temple of Apshai, um, because it had maps, and so that gave me maps. And Temple of Apshai is the Egyptian god of insects, and so they had a lot of giant bugs. And um, so I had used giant bugs in the game, and also I had picked up at Kmart the monster cards from that time period.
Oh wow, yeah.
And one of the new monsters on the monster cards was the Thri-kreen. And I thought, oh, these would go wonderfully with Temple of Apshai.
So it's like kismet that you wound up writing Thri-kreen of Athos.
Yes, I was a very early adopter of Thri-kreen love.
For those who don't know, those monster cards were index cards, which is another thing people just don't use so much these days. But
Yeah.
about that size, and they had a
Mhm.
color painting, a color image of the monster, sometimes lifted from a product, but most often just a little painting in the style of the day, right? So Errol Otis did a bunch of them, and I think
I think the Thri-kreen was Jim Holloway on that one, if
Holloway,
I'm remembering.
and then the
Yeah.
stats on the back,
Yep.
and they seemed so cool. I never really found them to be useful. Like that was a product that um, I I was very excited about, and its actual utility never, which I guess is why they didn't keep making them.
I guess, yeah. There were other tries at similar things with a picture and the stats,
Yeah.
but yeah, it kind of guided the way you were doing things maybe a little too much, I guess. So,
All right, so I'm going to start my drawing as we continue to talk. I'm going to come over here
okay.
to for those who want to know, I'm using an Apple iPad Pro and an Apple Pencil and the Procreate app. None of this is sponsored, but I say that because people ask and because I like all these tools. These are what I use in my personal drawing life. And I'm going to be doing a homage to this cover of Hellbound.
Nice. Okay.
So, when was the first time you went to a convention? So, I mean, you were gaming with your friends there in your hometown.
Right.
When did you get introduced to the broader world of gaming?
It wasn't long after that. So early 80s, there were a couple of nearby conventions. In Grand Island, Nebraska was one of the conventions that I remember. Uh, and I think I must have gone to Rockford, Illinois, as one of the early ones. Yeah, that would have been one of the early ones that I went to. Um, and actually, conventions played a role in how I got into the industry side of the hobby.
Oh, how so?
Well, in college, I was on a College Bowl team, which is kind of a trivia contest with wide-ranging subjects. And our team won the local campus College Bowl competition, and so we went to regionals. And we were in northern Missouri and northwest Missouri State, Maryville, Missouri, which will be relevant here in a second.
Okay.
And the regionals were in Oklahoma. So we drove to Oklahoma, and we got there stupid early in the morning after, not enough sleep because we were college students.
Mm.
And we went into a match almost immediately, and just got whipped. And so after the match, we went to a hotel room that we'd gotten, and we kind of regrouped, and we caught a part of a D&D cartoon episode on TV. And when we
The cartoon.
Yep. And when we went back to the second match, we had regrouped enough, and we were doing very well. And then during the time between the halves of the match, we were kind of talking about the D&D cartoon, and the timekeeper piped up and said, "Oh, I used to work for TSR." Well, the natural question is, well, how did you get to work for TSR?
Right.
And he said, I went to a lot of conventions, and they recognized me for my play, and they invited me to apply. And I thought to myself at the time, because I was part of the organization. I was in student politics, and I was part of the organization that brought entertainment to the campus.
Mm.
And I thought, well, I can't go to a lot of conventions, but I can start one. And so I even got a small budget from the college, and was able to provide rooms for a handful of guests. And I had met by this point, or at least become acquainted with the RPGA. And that was Gene Raby and Skip Williams, and I had met Frank Mentzer by that point. And so I started the convention, invited them as guests, along with Penny, who is now Penny Williams. And so we invited them to help to be guests of honor at the convention. And I had been to a few other local conventions by that point, so I kind of knew what I was doing. And I had the keys to the building. Working for the organization that had entertainment, I literally had all the keys to the student union. So we set up in all the meeting rooms, and it went very well. There were a couple of glitches, but we handled them. And at the end of the convention, Gene Raby said, "You ought to come up and help with Gen Con." And I accepted, not realizing at the time that it was a trap, and that I would never be able to go to a convention again and not feel like I should be working.
Yeah, that's how they get you.
Yes. So and the convention in Maryville, Missouri was called VilCon.
So the you said you'd had some interactions with the RPGA before that. Was that at some of these other conventions that you had been to, or?
It was. There were RPGA events, and I think it must have been at the convention in Rockford, RockCon, where I met Gene and Skip. At least that's my possibly faulty recollection. Well, I also met Gary Gygax for the first time there. And he signed a couple books for me and gave me some advice. Which came down to the advice that experienced authors tend to give to budding authors, that if you want to write, then you sit down and you write.
Right. Right.
And it is as simple and as difficult as that.
Yeah. Writers write always.
Yes.
What was your interaction with writing before that? Was that before D&D? What did you think your life was going to be like?
Oh, I did not. Well, actually, I expected to be a computer programmer. I went into computer science as my major when I started out. And after VilCon, the first one, and thinking about it, and then I had kind of a crisis. So after 4.5 years of college, approximately, I changed my major I thought about, what do I really want to do? And I looked at my fellow computer science major, and I thought, man, they love computers. I like them well enough, but I don't love them the way they do. Right. And I thought, maybe I don't want to be sitting behind a keyboard all day long, every day, which is kind of the irony. Then I ended up in game design, where I sit behind a keyboard most of the time. But there's also the personal interaction. So after 4.5 years, give or take, of a computer science major, I changed my major to history to give myself background for game design and a little bit of writing experience with the papers that I would have to do for it. And that's, I finished up the major fairly quickly and then went on and got a master's in history.
All fancy with your masters.
So, yeah, that was my educational path. And at a certain point, I made the decision that I wanted to be a game designer, and that was how I was going to do it.
All right. So then, how'd you do it? Did you make that decision? And you did it, right? I know a lot of people who kind of make that decision and can't get past the thinking phase. How did you become a gaming professional?
So, and this is kind of the advice I have given to other people after that, but basically I got lucky. But in more precise terms, I made my own luck. So what I did was, first I entered a couple of RPGA contests, writing contests, like, describe the characters in this piece of art. Who are they? What do they do? Or there were a couple of RPGA competitions of making places for the Living City. And I missed out on the first one of those, but the second one was to create entries into the medieval fantasy circus that was based in the Living City. And so I wrote a couple of those, and I think I kind of gave myself an out subconsciously because I didn't turn them in by deadline. What I did is I had created 3 entries, and the Winter Fantasy Convention in Milwaukee at the time was very close to the deadline, so I just took the 3 entries with me, and I gave them to Gene, and I think that way I subconsciously gave myself an out. If they were rejected, obviously it was because they were late, not because they weren't good enough.
Right.
But as it turns out, Gene liked them and accepted them, and had me go home and write more. So I ended up having, I think, 7 different pieces in that collection for the Medieval Fantasy Circus.
Nice.
And then that got me hooked in better with the RPGA, and I was also working in their HQ. At one point in my first Gen Con, Gene and Skip both had to be out of the HQ for a time for different events, and they looked at me and said, "Tim, you're in charge." And I'm like, "Okay, I guess I'm in charge."
Congratulations. Now we all move up in rank.
Yes. And so when I went to, let's see, this must have been the next Winter Fantasy, and I was ready to submit an application at that time. So I submitted a resume, and let's see, trying to get the timeline straight here. So I submitted a resume, and how did this work?
So let's to work at RPGA in the
actually, I think
TSR in general.
I think I submitted the resume to be a game designer. But let's go back to the Gen Con before that Winter Fantasy. So in 1990, okay. Here's another thing that you may not know about me. In 1990, I ran for state representative in Iowa.
I did not know that about you.
I had been heavily involved in student politics, and I was student body president for 2 years in college and a bunch of other stuff. And when it came time for me to finish my master's and graduate, a friend of mine that I had run with earlier in my college career called me up and said, "Hey, we need a Democrat to run in your district." And I said, "Well, I would be running against a family friend." And he said, "So?" And so I went and I got my petition signed and I ran against the family friend. And we had one of the most respectful, friendliest campaigns that you'd ever want to see. And perhaps one of the last ones like that in American history. But, we would go to these events and compliment each other and to talk. And we were very friendly and respectful. But at that particular Gen Con, they were going to hire a tournament coordinator, a new position with the RPGA. And they asked if I wanted it. And I said, well, I've got this election coming up in a couple months, and I think it would be really bad form to accept a job and then, try to win the election. And
Right.
and they agreed. And they put it off, and they hired somebody else. So by the following Winter Fantasy, and also at that Gen Con, I caught Doug Niles after a seminar where he had talked about the Mastika campaign
Right.
setting for the Forgotten Realms. He had written 3 books set in Mastika, which was kind of based on the Aztecs and Mayans, and I had been studying that in history classes. And so after the seminar, I caught up with him and I talked to him about a little bit of that kind of stuff. And after Gen Con, I sent him a snail mail letter and I said, this is how the Aztec calendar works, and this is how you can make it work with the existing Forgotten Realms calendar.
Mm-hmm.
And so Winter Fantasy came, and by this point, the person they'd hired as tournament coordinator was not doing very well. And so a bunch of stuff happened kind of all together. First, when I got home from Winter Fantasy after turning in a resume, I got home from Winter Fantasy and there was a letter for me from Doug Niles saying, hey, I've gotten behind on the box set. Would you be willing to write a few pages? And of course, my answer was, oh my God, yes. Not quite, as uncool as it was in my head, I hope. But But I said, yes, I would like to do that. I had cousins that lived in the Lake Geneva area, so I went up to stay with them for a couple of weeks, and went to Doug's house, and we talked about the project, and he paid me part of it in advance, and I got to working. And during this time, the tournament coordinator for RPGA had he was done. And so Gene asked me, we did it basically an interview in the car on the way to dinner one night. And she asked me how soon I could start. And I said, well, pretty much any time. And she said, this was, I think, a Friday. And she said, how about Monday? And I said, well, I think I could make that work. And I did make it work. And so I started with the RPGA. And then 6 months later, give or take, I think it was Tim Brown who came to me first and said, we have your resume. Are you still interested in being a game designer? And by this point, I'd had stuff in the Mastika box set, and Jeff Grubb had picked up some of this stuff that I wrote for it and put it in his first adventure. And Jeff was incredibly generous. He asked me how I wanted to be credited on the cover of the adventure, if I wanted to be credited as Jeff Grubb with Tim Beach or Jeff Grubb and Tim Beach, and I chose the and so my very first cover credit for TSR was Jeff Grubb and Tim Beach, and I, cannot thank him enough for doing that for me.
Jeff is a super guy.
Yeah. So between Doug and Jeff going to their boss Jim Ward and saying, you might want to think about hiring this guy. A few months in, Tim Brown came to me and said, hey, are you still interested in that game design position? I said, well, yeah, but I've got Gen Con coming up and I can't really abandon the RPGA. And Bruce Hurd, same question, you still interested in that job? And I said, well, yeah, but RPGA. And so sometime around there in the summer before Gen Con, I went in one morning and there was a Vikings handbook on my chair,
Right.
and a letter that did not have my name on it and was not signed, but it basically said, if you are interested in the game design position, create an encounter based on the Vikings handbook and turn it into, they named one of the secretaries,
Right.
by such and such a date. And so I made the encounter, and turned it in, and then I didn't hear anything back, and I didn't hear anything back. And then as we approached Gen Con, I started watching people interview for a game design position, and they were interviewing in the meeting room catty cornered from my cube in the RPGA. And I'm just going, halfway nuts thinking about this. And so Gen Con came and went. And then one day I walked in and I get a call from our computer department. Her name was Judy.
That was the name of our computer department.
Yeah. And Judy said, "So you're transferring to design, right?" And I said, "Well, I had not heard." This was a Monday morning. And so I went to Jean, as my boss, and
Yeah.
I said, "I got this call." And she kind of deflected, and I had been going to some of the product meetings by that point. I was in the Forgotten Realms group. And so at the Forgotten Realms group, they're talking about how, and this is again Monday, they're talking about how,
Oh
so
man.
we've hired, yeah, so we've hired Thomas Reed and John Ratliff as editors, and we've hired Rich Baker as a designer. Does anybody know who the other designer is? And I'm thinking, maybe, but I don't want to say anything, because what if I did
What if
not
you're
get a
wrong?
call I was supposed to get? So I went to Jeff after the meeting and I said, "Well, I got this call this morning," and he said he would go and try to find out, and they wouldn't tell him. Um, and,
So man, this so fits how that company was run.
and they made me wait until Thursday before they made it official.
Someone knew the whole time. Like, they were
Yeah,
stringing you along for the fun of it.
yeah, that's my only conclusion. Yeah,
Things happen. The plus side is things happen fast, and if you were in the right place at the right time,
yeah,
you could do it. On the other hand, you tell that story, and I'm like, when you say to them, "Well, I can't walk out on the RPGA. We've got Gen Con," and I'm like, they couldn't possibly want you to walk out on the RPGA. I mean, that was. It's not like it was another company. That was part of TSR too. So
exactly.
I think, I, in my head, and knowing a bunch of the people involved, they were like, "Oh, this guy's cute. He really feels. Let's test his loyalty here. That'll be fun."
He feels an obligation.
Yeah.
How quaint.
All right.
Yeah.
So, all right, that's enough sketching. I'm gonna put this down for half a second while we continue talking. So now you're on. We're all going to look up here and see. We've had Linnea came in earlier on her break. She must be gone by now, but thank you for stopping in, Linnea. Ravenlore is here and says, "Good evening. Where is Tim driving to?" This is his mobile studio, man. He's on the go.
Yeah.
He's got a lot of shows to do.
Yes. If it makes you
Ranker
feel better, I'm
80.
not driving at the moment.
Yes, no, that was part of the deal. Is he's not driving. I don't. Yeah, I don't want him to get pulled over and then me to get a ticket for abetting him. So, podcasting on the move in a 35 zone, eh? Um, and Rebecca's here. Hello, Rebecca. And I'm looking up. We've got about 20, 25 people watching us among various places. Uh,
Right.
Mostly Facebook and YouTube. If you type in the chat, I will see it. while we're live. If you're at one of the other sites, then I won't see it, but I'll stop by and look later. All right, so you're finally on staff. You've already
Yeah.
got a couple of projects under your belt. You've got a Jeff Grubb and Tim Beach credit on your bibliography. Where'd you go from there?
So my first official assignment was Assault on Raven's Ruin, which was for the basic D&D line, where they wanted to introduce the idea of thieves and traps.
So just for a pause there, because I like to make sure we give information for the youngins out there, as in anyone under 35 or 40, who don't remember that in the 80s and into the 90s, there was a difference between AD&D, or Advanced Dungeons and Dragons, and just Dungeons and Dragons. They were two related but different games.
Yeah.
So this was a product for the D&D game.
Correct. Yeah.
Right.
They were doing a series of short adventures. Yeah. So the first the first thing to know about this is that this fell under Steve Winter, who at that time was heading up the AD&D group, and D&D Basic fell under him, and I'm sure a couple of other things too. But so I was looking at the project and I misread the deadline.
Okay.
And because it was on one of those sell sheets that were in the catalog, and there were different dates in different places, and so I misread the deadline. And so Steve came to me one day and said, "Let's go for a walk." which is light corporate speak for "you have screwed up and we need to talk about it."
So let's go for a walk has come up in a few different conversations, often associated with Jim Ward, who is famous for saying, "Come walk around the building with me."
Right. Yes. So I went on a walk with Steve, and we actually walked around the outside of the building, and we got things straightened out, and I finished the very small adventure in the next couple of days, and got myself on pretty good track by then. And on to the next project, which I think was Wizards Challenge, which was an AD&D adventure focusing on wizards. And then on to other things. I don't even remember the order anymore, but those were my first two official as a game designer products.
So excuse me, I'm going to mute myself for a second. Sorry about that. Allergies. So you were. How long was this first adventure? Was it like a 32 pager, or as long or was it short?
16 pages.
16. Oh wow.
So for me to be behind on a 16 pager, I mean, no wonder Steve said, "Let's go for a walk." Right.
So this reminds me of a story that Owen Casey Stevens likes to tell about when he came, because he came from working as a freelancer mostly for the magazines, and there was he'd never been given deadlines that at the start of a project he'd work on stuff and it'd come in and get turned around. Right. So he comes in for his first day of work at Wizards, and is getting shown around, and Thomas Reed, who you mentioned earlier, was his manager, and he's asking him, so how much am I going to have to do? And he's nervous about this because he's never worked doing writing all the time. He doesn't know. He's really not sure he can do it at all the time, and he doesn't know what the speed he's expected to write at. Thomas says, "Relax, don't worry about it. We're not, it's your first day. We're going to do a bunch of things. You're not going to have anything on your plate for a while." And Owen's like, "I'd really like to know." And Thomas says, just relax. he's introducing him around, and he brings Owen to my office. I was a manager at that time too, but I had freelance. I was writing my first novel for TSR book department, which had been given to. I took over from another author, and so I was on a very ramped up schedule. And
Right.
Thomas came in as we came by. He said, "How's the novel coming?" I said, "Well, uh, you know, I wrote about 14,000 words over the weekend, but I was really trying to hit 20." Now, of course, this was crazy, but it was what had to be done. Owen
Right.
didn't understand that. He just heard me say, "Well, I hit 14, but I was trying to get 20 over the weekend." And he's like, I can't. Well, and so they get back um, to the office after going around. He's like sweating the rest of his way, introducing people. "I can't write 14,000 words. I don't know. I don't know." And he gets down. "Thomas, I need to know how much I have to write." And he's like, "It's okay. No, no, I need to know." And Thomas tells him, "Okay, no, we're expecting that you'll get about 5,000 words a week done." And he's like, "Oh,
Mhm.
okay." I,
Yeah. Yeah. Later on in my career, I got de- well, so I got delayed by working on the Monstrous Manual at one point, um, and that made me late on a Gamma World adventure, which you know, core book versus second tier product line. I didn't feel bad about that, but then later I was getting a tight deadline coming up right against the deadline on one of the Elminster's ecologies, and I had a convention coming up, and they were, making noises about me not going to the convention if I didn't have enough of a turnover ready. Um, and I that was my peak. I did 20,000 words in one day.
oh boy.
Yeah, it was a long day. But also I had everything outlined. I had it in my head, and I used note cards at the time to outline, and so I had the series of note cards. So I could take a note card, see my note, write two paragraphs. See a note card, write a couple, three paragraphs, and on and on. And so I could just practically dump it out of my head onto the page.
Right,
Otherwise, there's no way I could have done that. And I'm sure I've never hit that again. Um, but yeah, there's times when you just have to write a lot really fast.
right. And I mean, my novel was a similar situation. I had tightly outlined that novel. I knew I had each chapter. I'd already written like a 1,000 or 1,500 word outline, and I knew that
Yeah,
it was only going to be a 5 or 6,000 word thing. So it was a lot of. Um, it was there. Right? It was just filling the balloon. It wasn't
right,
making it up from scratch.
right. Yeah.
um, all right. So, what are some of the D&D products that you worked on that you, as you look back on it, are on your highlight reel?
So Thri-kreen of Athos was a dream product for me.
As
I'd been
earlier.
again having been an early adopter, but Thomas, going back to him again, was running a Dark Sun campaign for a group of us. Rich Baker and both Rich's and Thomas's wives were playing. Wolfgang Bauer played with us for a little while. And I was playing, and we had a couple of other people drop in and out occasionally, but I was playing a Thri-kreen character in a regular Dark Sun campaign. And between Wolf and I, we were coming up with some of the lore. And I was an atypical Thri-kreen. He was a very typical Thri-kreen.
Okay.
Um, and so I requested the Thri-kreen book, and they gave it to me, um, and I did a ton of research for it on mantis species. I went back into the lore of the Thri-kreen from that monster card on through all the different styles of art and the artists that had done it. And I am very, very proud of Thri-kreen, and it is it was one of my favorite things to work on. And other projects had there's something good about every project.
Right.
Another one that I really enjoyed writing was Magitech for the Amazing Engine game.
Right.
Which the idea was that it would be the Amazing game engine based on the Amazing magazine. So we would tell short stories, individual games, all using the unified game system, rather. And then it got to different parts in the company, and so it went from the Amazing Engine to the Amazing Engine system, and the cover ended up having the Amazing Engine system game all on the cover. It's like, you could have just said Amazing Engine, because engine and system and game all mean the same thing. But but that was nice. But so I really enjoyed.
I'll interrupt you briefly on that. I don't. You probably don't. Well, one part of this you don't know for sure. Thomas Reed, who we've now talked about several times in this conversation, is supposed to be my guest next week. So
okay.
I'll probably ask him what he thinks of you, and he'll tell me all the bad stuff. And when Karen S. Conlon, who was Karen Baumgartner back then, was a guest a couple of months ago, we talked a bit about the Amazing Engine. So if folks want to hear more about that, maybe you go look up that episode too. Anyway, I just wanted to put those footnotes in and then return to your story.
Magitech was, I started with the idea of what would the Forgotten Realms look like if it advanced to an actual 20th century type of setting. And I ended up using my history major and taking Earth history and deciding that there was magic all along, and what does that look like in the 20th century with magic. That was Magitech, and I had a lot of fun.
That had a minotaur on a flying carpet on the cover.
That is the one. Yep.
I remember that clearly. I had always gotten the idea that was like a university-based game. That was like a magic school.
Well, he was the Minotaur was wearing. So
football jersey, which is probably what.
Yeah. So because I decided that Texas would be where the Minotaurs live, because you had the Texas Longhorns and some other things there, and I'd done several conventions at Texas A&M College Station, and so if you look at the jersey that he's wearing, it has the number 12 on it, because College Station, Texas A&M, had the 12th man before Seattle and the Seahawks bought the rights to use it for the 12th man stuff in Seattle. So yeah, he is the 12th man on the Texas A&M team. Sort of.
So one of the things, and maybe this is a good time to talking a bit about what you're working on now. One of the things I loved about the, let's call it, imperfect experiment that was Amazing Engine is the concept that this was a game that you played and your character got to take the experience they earned in one game world, one game setting, and carry it through and be reimagined for the next game setting. So basically, you as a player were earning XP for all your future characters, and that way, with the game, theoretically, you could play in Magitech for a while. And there were a half dozen or more campaign settings that got put out for that.
Uh, Bug Hunters and Galactus Barrier and for Fairy Queen and Country. Yeah, and I'm sure, let's see, Chromosome was, I think, the one that Wolf did.
Oh,
Yeah, there were around a half dozen, 6 or
yeah.
8 by the time all was said and done.
I thought that was brilliant. The game, and I think we talked about this before when I was talking with Karen. The game part was a little 32-page module that came with each uh, was shrink wrapped with the setting books, and so each one kind of appeared as its own. You could pick up just Chromosome or just Magitech as a game, and the rules were this little amazing engine booklet, and the book was the world book, and then
Right.
you could transfer them across. And I thought that was brilliant. The
Yeah, and I
execution turned out it was a great idea, and I'm not even going to say it was badly done. It just wasn't for its time, I think.
right, and the idea of bundling the 2 books together became one of the problems. And so on Magitech, I cheated a little bit, and I included the basic rules. But it was at a time when that wasn't a bad idea. The first 2 settings came always bundled with the rules book. So by the time mine was going to be released, it wasn't going to come with that. So I included the basic rules in the text of Magitech. But yeah, it was not executed as well as it could have been, I think, and again, for the time, it wasn't the right thing.
I think
So.
that I always look at, like, I mean, I certainly have my own take on game design style. So it was not the game I would have made it to be, but it certainly worked as a 32-page
Yeah,
game. And I think the main thing was that the audience wasn't screaming for that concept. That the whole concept itself kind of left the audience going, if I want to play another game, I'll buy another game.
yeah, yeah. Yeah,
Um,
the idea of the eternal hero that you could take the kernel from world to world. I mean, I loved that concept, still do, but that
yeah,
didn't appeal to a wide-ranging audience, I guess.
I kept one of those. There were several things I kept at my desk in at TSR and Wizards, and would trot out and bring them to uh, meetings at least 2 or 3 times a year. And one of them was the Amazing Engine core book. It just kind of as a this is a thing we can do. I was uh,
Yeah,
I was shocked how even just 5 years later, the number of people who were like, "What is that thing?"
yeah.
It should be remembered. So, having said all that, what's the thing that you're working on now?
So I have over the last several years, I've gotten kind of increasingly bothered by the thickness of the books and the increased cost of the books um, to get you into this game that we love so much. And I kept thinking there ought to be an easier way to do it. And I looked around and I didn't find what I wanted, so I made it. And so that's my introductory role playing game. Start here.
Pull it
Um,
a little closer to your face. Pull it back. There you
oh,
go. Now people can see it.
okay,
Start here.
cool, cool.
I'm going to switch my views here for a second so that people can see it a little bigger. Start here.
Yep. The introductory role playing game. It is uh, the system that uses a D20 stripped down to its bare essence with 6 ability scores and a 20-sided die, and I can teach it to people in 5 minutes, literally. And I honestly think it is the game the hobby has needed for a good 30 years, if not most of the 50 that we've been around.
Right.
Um, when when I started seeing classes at local game stores, and more power to them for supporting the gaming and everything by having classes to learn D&D in the stores. But not only that, but when you have classes at the local game stores to create a character, it just seems like just so much. And how do you bring people into this hobby? And so that was my focus. I wanted something very easy to onboard people. And if people play my game and they learn with it, and then they go on to D&D or Pathfinder or anything else, if I made it easier for them, I am satisfied. I've done the job that I'm trying to do. But yeah, literally, I can teach the rules to somebody in 5 minutes. You can make a character in my system in 10 minutes if you're a little indecisive. So,
So
um,
this also, I think, um, points back, and I'm sure that a lot of this, I'm, I'm guessing you're going to agree with this, that this uh, is something that's proven in in convention. Like we at TSR and every game company I've ever worked at, going to a large convention like Gen Con, you've got demos that you do for the people who are already gamers, but you always have something that's for the person who walks up and goes, I don't understand it. What is this thing? And you teach them to play in 5 minutes so that they can start playing, and then you can sell them something in 20 minutes.
right. Yeah, and that was another kind of disappointing thing for me that I saw over and over again, both at TSR and at Wizards of the Coast, and with Paizo and other companies too, was the introductory set. And I don't know how many we did at TSR when I was there.
One a
Wizards
year.
did, yeah, and um, and Wizards has done them, and you know anybody that's publishing like that kind of dips their foot into um, the introductory for their game, and while there's nothing wrong with that, and I understand why from a business perspective they do it, um, they aren't actually making the game easier. They're just giving you less of the complicated game.
Right.
Uh, and I'm not disparaging the introductory sets. Some of the sets have been very, very good, but I wanted an easier game.
Yes.
To get the concepts across, to say, you know, this is all you have to worry about. And Stan, you helped me on the character sheet. The first character sheet for my game that you saw had several entries under the ability scores, and your reaction was that still seems like a lot, and and perfectly legit. And I incorporated that, and so the character sheet is much simplified, thanks to you, to where each ability score, 6 ability scores. So, for example, under strength, the game works on an action roll where you roll the die and you add the ability score versus the target number, which is usually 10 plus the other guy's ability score.
Right.
And so under strength, I have the target number listed, which I call brawn, and then the action roll, which I call might, and then a save, which I call toughness. And each ability score has a target number, an action roll, and a save. And that I've probably given you 50 to 75% of the game system now.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I really, and I think that when we were talking about it, I was telling you this, and I love this because I have had a similar thought, which came out of the thought I just was started with earlier. Is we make these games for conventions that anyone can play in, get going and play in 5 minutes, and everyone has a great time. Why can't that be the game? Right? I get that we want to sell them. You want to sell them your 300-page book, great, but this this game is a good game. Why can't we have an easy game? And so, like you, I have spent a lot of time kind of playing with different versions of that. Um, I guess the I think I may have mentioned this other places, but I've got one that I may start bringing to light over the course end of this year or next year.
Okay.
But not with the same target as you. And it would take me a lot of work to get something that's as well thought through as what you've got there with Start Here.
Well, thank you. I realized not too long ago that when I went to Origins a few weeks ago, and one of those Facebook memories came up from 2009, and in 2009, I went to Origins and I play tested an early version of this game there. So it's been in my head for at least 15 years. And I've play tested it a lot. Simplifying was one of the hardest things to do until I got in that mode of, realizing I don't have to duplicate everything the more complex games do. They already do that.
Right.
If you want spell feats that adjust your range and area of effect and things like that, there is a game for that. My game doesn't have to do that.
Yeah, no, I totally feel you. That's the kind of thing that happens all the time, right? You start
Yeah.
off with something simple, and well, what if I add this in? Being able to take that step back and go, yeah, that's fine, but that's not what this game is. You're now moving outside.
Yeah, and so the meta rule when I was designing it was when I got to the point where there's multiple ifs in a rule, that has to stop being a rule. If I need a flow chart to follow the rule, that's not a rule for my game.
Right.
So yeah, it is. I've tried to keep it very, very easy. And then when we were producing it, my business manager, Jessica Goldstein Blair, pointed out to me that if we wanted to actually deliver to our Kickstarter backers in a timely manner, I could not possibly write it all myself.
Right.
But then that resulted in us bringing in Janelle Jaquays, Jamie Chambers, and Elisa Teague, and a relative newcomer when you're talking about some of us, Misha Bushyager. And so they all came in as part of the project. Janelle, wanted to break out of the fantasy mold that she'd been in for so long. And I had 4 settings for the game initially. Serpents and Strongholds is the fantasy setting. Star X is science fiction. Wizards and Wranglers is Wild West with magic and elves and dragons. And Zombiesaurus Rex, I hope I don't need to explain. Zombies and dinosaurs. And you can fight them with music. But
rock on.
But Janelle wanted to do Wizards and Wranglers. She wanted to do something different. And then she got sick. And and I was talking to Jessica about it, and I said, if we want to consider another, and I phrased it like this because, let's be honest, I said, if we want to consider another old white guy, we would do worse than to ask Ed Greenwood. And so we did, and Ed's response was something along the lines of, I am super busy, I am completely booked, so of course I will do it as long as you pay her.
No, Ed's awesome.
Yeah.
Ed, for those who've been watching, Ed is another person who's supposed to be on, kind of like you do. We had complications and had to bump him, but they were complications that have now been solved. So I've just this week been chatting with him about getting him on the show. We don't have a date yet, but Ed Greenwood will be on at some point in the future. Knock on plywood.
Yes. Yeah, Ed is such a great guy. He wrote. Now, Ed has a reputation of maybe overwriting a little bit. I mean, he's like the gaming equivalent of Stephen King.
A well-deserved reputation.
Yeah.
Well-earned.
So when Ed turned over the Wizards and Wranglers material to me, he had overwritten by, I think, 56 words.
Woo!
I mean, he he could not have hit the target more precisely, had I been sitting over his shoulder. Say, you got to make that paragraph shorter. But, no, but yeah, he turned over some great stuff, and then he contributed to Serpents and Strongholds and Star X a little later too. He did did me a huge favor, but also I think he seems to also be on the bandwagon that this is a thing that we need
Yeah.
in game.
All right, I'm going to put my drawing down here. This is where we got during the show. I'm going to finish this, as I always do, in the next couple of days. If you are a subscriber to, where is that little link there? To 50 years in the dungeon.substack.com, the free newsletter. You will get to see this as soon as it's done. Otherwise, I'll release it publicly. I released one from a few weeks ago, earlier today. It'll get out eventually. I'm not going to withhold this from you. But if you want to see it earlier and you want some other behind the scenes stuff, that's where you go. So I'm going to put this down and switch back to just you and me.
Okay.
Once again, an hour has flown by like that. But before we start getting into the farewells, as I said at the beginning, the impetus for this show is this is the 50th anniversary of not just D&D, because it's the 50th anniversary of D&D. It's also the 50th anniversary of role playing as a hobby, as a game.
Right.
And certainly with Start Here, you are now adding to, going forward, how easy it is, or what people's first impression in role playing is. So you may be a good person to ask about your perceptions about how this first half century is gone.
Man, there have been some ups and downs, haven't there? I was talking to Tony DiTerlizzi recently. He's been doing a retrospective on the stuff that the artwork he did for the Monstrous Manual.
Yeah,
and so
I'm just going to pause there. For those who don't know, Tony DiTerlizzi, as Tim said, did a lot of art for the second edition for the AD&D Monstrous Manual, and has gone on to be a best-selling and many times nominated artist and writer. The creator of Wandala, which is on Apple Plus now, which is crazy to me, and Spiderwick and lots of other things.
Yeah, Spiderwick will be coming to some channel. I'm not sure which one it ended up on. Was it Netflix?
I think so. Yeah.
Okay. So yeah, and Tony and I were talking about, because we were working together, 30 years ago, which I can't even say that and think it's real. But we were working together 30 years ago for the 20th anniversary of D&D, and I don't really remember much being done at that point. I think that's when the trivia game came out, and there were a couple of kind of splashy things that said 20th anniversary, but it wasn't a big deal. And and one of the things that Tony and I have talked about, and I would imagine you've hit on this with some of the other guests, is that we didn't realize at the time that we were either making history or being part of history.
Yeah.
That it's just kind of blown up, because at the time, it was a hobby game and nerds were still picked on, and it wasn't a big deal. And then this was right after the Satanic Panic of the 80s, and so we had to be very careful about what we're writing, because as Jim Ward was fond of saying, he didn't want an angry mother coming to him and saying, "What are you publishing?"
Yeah.
And to see it grow past that, where it's not only socially acceptable, but part of the collective unconscious of the country, and parts of the world, not all parts of the world, but definitely, besides the U.S., it's big in several of the European nations, and it started the whole thing, and especially when celebrities are in on it now and proudly saying, "I play D&D."
Right.
And it's been, they don't know what us geeks and nerds went through in the 80s. But it was fantastic to see that it's become such a respected thing, and not just respected, but expected.
Right.
I play D&D. Yeah, cool.
Yeah.
Um, it, it, it's a wonder to me.
So, I mean, you bring that up when the 20th anniversary happened right before I joined TSR. I was working in the industry, but not at TSR. And from when I came there, my understanding talking to people is it kind of snuck up on the company. Like no one even thought about it. But
Right,
5 years later, after Wizards had bought out the company, we had a 25th anniversary tour, and there were special products a
right.
whole year of products that were planned for it. And I think that was in the wake of the 20th anniversary stuff being what can we cobble together quickly because we didn't realize we were here. And
Right.
it's fun to see now the 50th anniversary how much of a it's not just TSR doing it. It's all over, or not Wizards. It's
Yeah.
all over.
Yeah, it's grown into a much bigger thing than any of us would have expected playing around the kitchen table or whatever it was when we were playing. Um, which again is great, and I can tell somebody at a coworker or whatever that, oh yeah, I used to write D&D as my full-time job.
Yeah.
Cool.
Well, you know what? When I moved out here to Seattle, and I was telling people that's what I was doing, the reaction then had been, "Oh, do people still do that? Is that still around?" And now it's like, "You do what?"
Yeah. Yeah, and when I was in college, and I went directly from college to, well, with a brief stop on the campaign trail, but then I went to CSR. And when I would go back and visit college, I would try to tell the people that I knew there what I was doing. I'm writing games, and they couldn't comprehend.
it's, it's a
The
thing.
first thing, you're renting games? Like, they thought I was renting pinball machines to, different places and things like that. And I said, no, actually, those games you play, somebody actually has to sit down and figure out how they work.
Those words don't magically appear.
Yeah.
Uh, I'm looking here at the chat because I had my head down, and you being on your mobile didn't see. Jeff Grubb has been in here chatting. He says hi. We had nice things to say about you before, Jeff, before you got here. We're done
Yeah.
now. Uh, Faith Price says hi, Tim and Stan.
Yep. Yep.
And David Shepard says he finally got to the live one. Congratulations, Dave. Glad you got to see part of this live and exciting.
Good. Good.
All right. So before I shuffle you off screen for a second, this game, you want to hold up your game one more time?
I do.
I bet you do.
I will wear it like a mask.
Woohoo! And I can find it here.
Yeah, and there's so the box set contains 3 different books. Book 1 is for beginning players, complete newcomers.
Mm-hmm.
Besides the very easy rules, all of which are contained in a 16-page section in the game. There's more about the rules because I have examples and stuff too. But it also has a sample of the fantasy setting, Serpents and Strongholds.
Mm-hmm.
Book 2 is for experienced players.
Okay.
Book 2 covers, by the way, are by a local artist named Rob Carlos, who is brilliant and did not only the 2 covers, but a lot of the interior art. These are a couple of the sample characters in Start Here. You
Nice.
can play and a Rust Monster Owlbearer Bulette as a player character in the Star X science fiction
Bulette.
setting,
Wow. All right.
which is in the Experienced Players book, and then the campaign sampler, which has a cover by Larry Elmore,
Nice.
who are
That guy. He's going places.
yeah
He's got a bright future in front of him, that Larry Elmore.
yeah. But the campaign sampler has more of each of the fantasy setting and the science fiction setting, as well as the Zombie Saurus Rex Modern Apocalypse and the Wizards and Wranglers Old West, Wild West with elves and dragons and magic. We
Excellent.
have customized metal dice.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Serpent holds S on the 20. Two different times.
Oh, yeah. No. If you
Yeah,
put it in front of your face, it'll be on screen.
red on the wall.
Right.
So yeah, and we're starting a thing. So one thing that my business manager Jessica did was, along with selling packages to retailers, she also sold me along with it. So I am obligated to do, and this is a good obligation to have. This is something that I really love doing. But doing demos in stores,
Right.
either in person or via Zoom. But I've got, I think, 25 of those to do throughout the rest of this year. Tomorrow we're getting a pallet of games in, and in the evening tomorrow we will be at the Game Shelf in Kent.
Yes.
So
So if you're a local listener, Tim is going to be in Kent, Washington, at the Game Shelf tomorrow. What time? 6 p.m. I think.
I believe 6:30 is the official start, but we're going to try to be there earlier and show the game around before we actually get into doing demos. And demos are just so quick with the game, and I always bring Lego figures to run my games because why wouldn't I?
Well, that's one of the things when you showed me the game. One of the first things you did was hand me a little Lego figure to hold while you explained it to me.
Yeah,
You got to give
yeah,
people a toy to play with.
yeah. And part of the game started out with I used to run Lego games at Gwen Kestrel and Andy Collins'
Mm,
house. They did a tiny little in-house convention called GwenCon after Gwen, and I would go and run Lego games. And one year before the game, one of my regular players, Rob Watkins, called up and said, "Hey, I want to bring my parents. They have never played a role-playing game before." And at the time, I was typing the characters in something like 6th level Ranger, and I thought, man, they have no idea what any of that means, not
right,
a bit of it.
right.
And so, how to make this accessible? And that was one of the things that got me really thinking about it.
So David Shepard writes, I have got some of Tim's products, but the most obscure product of his I own is Cloud Warriors from Fast Forward Entertainment.
Yep, that was fun. I did a couple things for Fast Forward Entertainment. Tim Brown and Lester Smith, and Jim was part of it as well. Yep. So yeah, I did some stuff on Cloud Warriors and the Dungeon World supplements and Rings of Power and figurines of power and
Yeah.
I did a bunch of stuff for them. It was a ton of fun. And
All
I did Bulette's as player character types.
all right. So as you say, you're going to be doing a lot of these in-store demos, either in person or uh, uh, online. And if you go to facebook.com/Beach House Games, Beach House RPGs. Let me say that again so I say it right. Facebook.com/Beach House RPGs. It's on the screen there if you're watching. That's the best place to keep track of that, right?
Right. So we did at the beginning of the year, and the confusion is natural because we did a very soft rebrand at the beginning of the year, Beach House Games. For those people not in the hobby industry, there is an organization, the HMA, the Hobby Manufacturers Association, that they keep track of a 3-letter code for manufacturers in the hobby industry. And so I wanted BHG, Beach House Games, but I found out it was taken by this little outfit called Better Homes and Gardens. So I was able to get BHR, and so the soft rebranded Beach House RPGs.
All right, Tim, thank you very much. I'm going to let you go so I don't take up too much of your time. You've got a lot to do. Thank you for being on the show. It's been great chatting with you. Maybe we can do this again.
Yeah, it has been great. Again, thank you for having me. I obviously love doing stuff like this.
All right, hold on. I'll come back to chat with you in a second. I'm just going to do my little outro over here and say thank you to Tim for coming. It's been great having this conversation. Like I said at the beginning, I get a lot out of this, just kind of getting to hang out with my friends and learn more about them. I did not know that Tim had run for office. Who would have guessed that? Anyway, thank you for tuning in. And again, if you want to get our free newsletter, it's at 50yearsinthedungeon.substack.com. And if you sign up for that, you'll get to see the finished version of the drawing I was working on just as soon as it is done. Otherwise, wait a week or two. It'll show up eventually. So thank you all. I will be back tomorrow night with another episode of Random Encounters, which is my improv cartooning show. Same time, same channel where you're watching this right now. Come on back. We'll have some fun. And until next week, take care